All right. A quorum being present, subcommittee will come to order. We're going to go ahead with an abbreviated agenda today, just due to time of our witnesses and be respectful because we are delayed. We're delayed by votes on the House floor, and our witnesses have a hard stop departure this afternoon. The ranking member, our witnesses, and I have agreed to forego our opening statements so we can proceed immediately to member questions and answers. Statements will be provided for the record. If anybody would like to read the witnesses' statements, opening statements of the members, I want to thank everyone for their cooperation and patience. It's the way the schedule goes sometimes. So without objection, everyone's opening statements will be entered in the record, and we'll now proceed to questions. And I guess I'm first. Ranking member's on his way. So, all right. Cuba. In recent years, attacks against dissidents and violations of human rights in Cuba have increased. And as of May 8, the Cuban Commission for Human Rights and National Reconciliation reported that there were at least 1,867 short-term detentions for political reasons in the first 4 months of 2017. Today, Cuba has at least 140 political prisoners. Despite the June rollout of new policy with emphasis on protecting the human rights of Cubans, democracy assistance to Cuba was cut from the 2018 request down from $20 million in democracy assistance in the 2016 that was used to support human rights groups, civil society on the island. So how does the administration reconcile the public support for human rights on one hand and freedom in Cuba with the elimination of funding that provides capacity building and support to local groups and organizations who are promoting these rights on the island? Ms. Palmieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. Foreign assistance was reduced globally, sir, and we believe we have a number of other tools that will permit us to continue to engage and press Cuba on the human rights front. We'll continue to use our embassy in Havana to do outreach to human rights and civil society groups. We'll engage in multilateral fora, such as the OAS and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We'll work with international partners, the EU and other countries of the Western Hemisphere to apply pressure, and we will continue through direct bilateral talks, such as the Human Rights Dialogue, continue to press Cuba on that specific issue, sir.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Yes, we have an existing appropriation that does get to the humanitarian assistance issues that you mentioned, whereby we are providing a package of goods to political dissidents, political prisoners, and their families, and we will continue to program that appropriation and with existing funding.
Sir, I was also remiss in not mentioning that the President's new National Security Presidential Memorandum makes it clear that engagement on human rights and democracy's issues in Cuba will be at the forefront of everything we do in the new policy.
Okay. Thank you for that. Focus on Venezuela. We have a letter going to President Trump on Venezuela. Current signers are myself, the ranking member, Ms. Ross Layton, and Francis Rooney. I'm going to ask to put this in the record, but also would like to pass this around if anyone would like to sign it. But Venezuela and some of the actions there by Maduro, creating a constituent assembly, they call it, and basically undermining the Venezuelan Constitution. Can you talk with me a little bit about what the focus is in this budget with Venezuela, with regard to what the United States is doing with Venezuela, and how it may positively or negatively impact the Maduro regime?
Yes, sir. We continue to be focused on the 4 commitments that the Venezuelan government made in the dialogue and mediation efforts that were led by the Vatican last fall. That is to immediately release all political prisoners, to schedule the elections that have been postponed, to address the humanitarian needs, and most importantly, sir, I think, to respect the Venezuelan Constitution and the role of the duly elected National Assembly to allow it to be a part of the democratic process more fully and to provide solutions to the crises in the country.
Yes, we have existing activities in Venezuela, working with civil society organizations with 4 U.S.-based NGOs here, and then 30 to 35 NGOs in Venezuela. And we'll continue to be working with those civil society organizations to increase awareness of what's happening on the ground, to increase the ability to report on human rights abuses, corruption, things of that nature. We're also working with the National Assembly to increase their ability to be legislators, doing training and capacity building there. In addition, we're doing assessments to the extent we can on the situation on the ground in the food area, in the economic area, in the financial area, and putting together those assessments so that should there be an opportunity to do more, we'll be prepared to have a good response.
Okay. Does the Department of State think that democracy and governance support is necessary in the Western Hemisphere?
Absolutely, sir.
Okay. You think that's broad? Let's broaden it beyond. You are from the Western Hemisphere sector, so maybe that's not fair, but you think that's a policy of the State Department in general to support democracy and governance?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. You also, would you agree that foreign aid is a tremendous foreign policy tool?
It is a critical and important part of our national power. Yes, sir.
So influencing foreign policy in a positive way with foreign aid is one thing. Withholding of foreign aid or limiting foreign aid could have a very impactful effort as well, I guess, right? I mean,
I would say, sir, there are many tools that we have at our disposal, and in a constrained budget environment, we have to determine which priorities and which tools we can use to their greatest effect based on each individual's circumstance. Yes.
let me just state for the record, there are a number of countries that receive a tremendous amount of U.S. foreign aid that don't support U.S. efforts sometimes, whether it's votes of the UN or the OAS. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. That's my opinion. I'm going to now turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this meeting. First of all, I thank you for coming before the committee, and I have certain concerns regarding this budget, especially some of the cuts. You know, I was in Honduras and Guatemala with my colleague, Ileana Rose-Layton, and one of the things that we saw there is how we're helping these countries, especially the attorney generals in those countries, keeping up under a lot of pressure. And I was wondering if some of the cuts are going to impact those attorney generals and their offices.
I would agree, sir, that the work of the 3 attorney generals in the Northern Triangle countries specifically have produced some important results over the last few years. There's a renewed commitment by all 3 of those individuals to attacking impunity, and the support that we can provide them is money well spent.
Yes, I totally agree with my colleague. We, under this budget request, we do suggest support, continued support for the attorneys general as well as other national institutions that get to issues of impunity and corruption, such as Moxie in Honduras.
It's also the elimination of the Food for Peace programming in the budget. I was wondering how you feel about that.
We will continue with some agriculture funding, and particularly where in the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle of Central America, as well as in Haiti.
Mr. Palmieri?
The food, I'm sorry, the Food for Peace program?
Yeah, programming.
Yeah, I would defer to my AID colleague's answer. Yes, sir.
Okay, and who will speak on funding global health? You will also? I know there's a 62% cut there also, so I was wondering how you feel about that.
Right. We do seek to continue funding global health in certain areas, in maternal and child health, for example, in Haiti, where where we want to build on the important work that we've already done there, as well as in Guatemala, where we're looking to shift much of that funding to nutrition, which is key to some of the important and most problematic issues in Guatemala, which are stunting.
And Mr. Palmieri, what kind of a message do you think we're sending to this part of the world when we have these cuts?
In Central America, I think what we are trying to do is build on the efforts that have been made in previous budgets. In fiscal year 15, in fiscal year 16, and in fiscal year 17, we have a combined $2 billion that we're directing to Central America. And so Secretary Tillerson with Secretary Kelly and Secretary Mnuchin hosted a conference last month on Central America where the president of Honduras, the president of Guatemala, and the vice president attended, and we began to look at ways that we can involve the private sector, multilateral development banks, and so that we can deepen the economic investments in the region, and through both our previous assistance and the additional money in the FY18 budget, we can begin to address some of the underlying conditions there.
Thank you. I don't want you to think this is the only administration I said this about. I was also concerned, the previous administration, that we were not focusing enough attention on the Western Hemisphere, because I really feel that it is one of those places where we have neglected, due to the fact that, you know, the world's at war, basically, and in the Middle East, and the focus of the attention is there. But I think we'd be short-sighted if we don't pay attention to our backyard. It is critical that we continue to support some of these programs and continue to have a relationship that, like we always had.
Yes, sir, I agree, and I think Secretary Tillerson has made the Western Hemisphere a priority at the start of his work here. The Central America Conference, his first trip was to Mexico. I think we are working hard at both the issues of national security and economic prosperity, because we do believe what's good for the United States is also good for the region, and working together, we can continue a positive path as you just outlined.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the security because some of the players that are going into South America are not our friends. So security is very important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I agree with you. I hope that is Tillerson's focus and opinion. I haven't asked him. I hope that's correct. I'll applaud him for that, because that's what we're going to focus on. I'll now go to the gentlelady from Florida, the former chairwoman and the current chairwoman of Middle East North Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to you both. As Mr. Sirius pointed out, he and I traveled to Guatemala and Honduras in March. It was a wonderful visit to great countries who are solid allies of the U.S. And while we were there in Honduras, I asked our ambassador to please look into the visa restrictions that we placed in previous administrations in 2009. And after nearly a decade, boy, we really need to return the visas to the Hondurans impacted. Could I receive your assurances, Mr. Palmieri, that you will look into this matter and that you would please get back to me on this?
We will absolutely get back to you on that issue, Mrs. Roslin.
Thank you. They've been so singled out and punished for adhering to the Constitution, and they were proven correct, but still they're unable to leave their country. So thank you so much. Furthermore, Mr. Palmieri, the Cuba directive, as we know, was issued on June 16th, and that directive states that the changes shall not prohibit the support for democracy programs in Cuba, and that's so important. But the budget proposal zeroed out budget programs in Cuba, and I know that the chairman and the ranking member have pointed that out, how these cuts just seem to be maybe penny wise, pound foolish. Can civil society groups in Cuba survive without this much-needed U.S. assistance?
I believe that the President's new National Security Policy Memorandum makes it a focus of the U.S. government's effort to engage on human rights and democracy in Cuba. And I believe we have tools that will be available to us through our embassy on the island, with multilateral partners, with other regional partners, to continue to engage with human rights activists on the island and civil society groups. And I believe the new policy will enable us to continue that engagement effectively.
Good, and we welcome the arrival of the new chief of that section or interest section or embassy or whatever it is we're calling it these days. In Nicaragua, as we know, the Ortega regime continues to use his cronies to threaten and undermine civil society members, human rights organizations. Yet again, the budget proposal zeroes out democracy programs in Nicaragua as well. What is the justification for doing that in Nicaragua, sir?
Again, I think foreign assistance was reduced globally. And in an era of constrained budgets, we had to make some difficult priority decisions. Again, in a place like Nicaragua, we have a fully staffed embassy. I think we can be effective and efficient with some of the other resources we will have at our disposal there to engage with the civil society and human rights activists and to try to continue to advance our national interests in Nicaragua.
Thank you. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We get to Venezuela, and I think that the programs in Venezuela have been transformational, have played a substantial and important role in helping the people of Venezuela. Would you both agree with that assessment? And I know that you're agreeing, but what is the justification of zeroing out funds for Venezuela when it's one of the most important programs with bicameral and bipartisan support on the Hill? It's become a great investment to advance U.S. interest in the region.
We absolutely need to continue to support the Venezuelan people in their effort to reestablish and restore their democratic institutions, and we will use all the tools available to us in that effort.
Thank you. And speaking of the tools, before the committee adjourns, I would kindly give you a list of more human rights violators of Venezuela whom we would like the administration to place on the sanctions list so that they're not able to come and visit Mickey Mouse in Disney World and shop at Bal Harbor and enjoy all the wonderful freedoms that we have here while they beat the heads and shoot at demonstrators in Venezuela. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to show a short video on the latest violence orchestrated by Maduro and his cronies against the people of Venezuela. And I'd like to thank the brave Venezuelan civil society groups on the ground for doing an amazing job of monitoring the situation, putting this video together for our subcommittee. Thank you.
Bajaron en la Plaza Francia, mira, algunos decían que no iban a bajar hacia la autopista. Otras personas. ¡Sí se puede! ¡Sí se puede! ¡Sí se puede! Respetando la virtud de honor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
I'll thank the gentlelady for her continued focus and helping keep this committee, subcommittee focused on Venezuela and the human rights abuses going there, and hopefully future regime change there that we all are hoping for. Chair will now go to Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our guests for being here. It's great to see you. As a founder of the Central America Caucus, I have been a strong supporter of U.S. Strategy for engagement in Central America. I have a firm commitment to continuing to work in the region in the Northern Triangle. And as we continue to make the argument for aid in Central America, we need to be able to account for where this aid is going. We need to effectively measure their progress and measure its impact. The first $750 million that we appropriated in fiscal year 2016, just to make sure none of that money has gone to the government of any of these countries. Is that correct? Directly into the coffers of the government.
That's correct. It is not our policy to deliver that money directly to the government.
I just wanted that for the record. There's been a lot of questions within groups around how that money is being spent. Can you account for how much has been spent in each country and how much is going through contractors versus NGOs, and how the money is balanced between the three main pillars, the rule of law, development, and security? I just want to make sure that the basic sense of where, and get a basic sense of where that money is going.
With all that detail, we may have to get back to you on some of those numbers, but I would say that it's not a cookie-cutter approach to each of the countries. So the sectors might vary from one country to another, and it depends on the emphasis of our programming.
In general, they go to three central pillars of our effort in Central America that get at the drivers of irregular migration. We're trying to improve all three countries' ability to address the security conditions in the country. We're trying to help them improve their governance, programs like improving their ability to collect taxes so that their institutions have the ability to provide social services.
And all of that is important, as well as education. And I want to make sure that the bulk of the money isn't just going for security or to build up more borders. I want to make sure that we are actually spending money to address the root causes that bring children to have to flee their country. How are you measuring progress in the Northern Triangle? What are the main indicators that you are using in order to ensure that what we are doing, the work that we're doing, is actually making a difference?
Some of the indicators that we have are that the governments are taking an interest in investing their own resources in many of the things that we're doing. So, for example, in Guatemala, we help stand up the 24-hour courts, which help them respond to the legislation that says a detainee has to report to a judge within 24 hours. We help stand up these courts. The Guatemalans have now taken them over. Another measure of success is private sector engagement. We now have a great number of private sector efforts there, public-private partnerships, if you will, with Microsoft in El Salvador is a good example where they're working with at-risk youth to educate them in various areas, including in computers. And then finally, civil society, keeping an eye on the government.
I want to thank you both for recognizing the efforts of CSIG and MOXIE, and the efforts of the attorney generals leading those causes, and the impacts that their work has had on their personal lives and their family, and the number of threats. Are you aware that 4 members of the Guatemalan Congress have hired and are paying $80,000 a month for a lobbying firm to come here, and I am assuming that they're lobbying against CSIG?
I have seen those press reports. that there is press reports of these 4 individuals engaging a lobbying effort. I do not have specific factual information about what they are funding or not funding.
At some point, I would like for you to report back to this committee if that is true, because I think that we are spending significant amount of money, amount of effort, our own time to focus on that. And as far as I'm concerned, my commitment to the Northern Triangle is contingent on the work of CSIG and the work of MOXIE.
Thank you. We'll do that.
Young lady's time's expired. The chair will now go to Mr. Rooney from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are 85 countries that don't take our deportees. ICE considers 23 of them recalcitrant countries. They consider 62 of them non-cooperators. There are 243,000 people, illegal, under deportation orders that their home country won't accept. 57,000 of them have been convicted of a crime. Cuba is number 2 in the people that they won't accept. That's 40,000. Haiti's number 3, 35,000. And Brazil's number 4 at 30,000. We had a fellow named John Jock, you may know about him, an illegal Haitian, who was 3 times ICE tried to return him to Haiti and they wouldn't take him. And within 6 months of the 3rd time, in mid-2016, he brutally murdered a 25-year-old lady in Connecticut. In 2015, we gave Haiti $500 million, and right now you're proposing giving Haiti $157.5 million. So my question is, and one more thing. In addition to countries that don't accept our deportees, we gave, in 2016, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, where I don't even think we had an ambassador at the time, $10 million. We gave Argentina $2.5 million. And in Bolivia, under Evo Morales in 2015, where I'm not sure we had an ambassador back down there by that time, we gave him $56.5 million. So my question is, why should we support AID when you're giving money to countries that won't accept our deportees and that are supporting countries where we can't even position an ambassador and are run by authoritarian dictators?
Sir, we've had a lot of very good investments, both in Haiti, in particular, in Ecuador in the past. We actually have not had a very extensive program in Ecuador in the recent past. For AID's part, we have about a $2 million project that has been funding civil society organizations, not the government at all. And those organizations actually draw attention to some of the issues that you raised. So they're there to raise awareness of things like human rights abuses, lack of governance, corruption, impunity, things of that nature. In Haiti, similarly, we do have an effort at civil society, building the capacity for organizations to do the same. At the same time, we are working, again, primarily with the NGO community and private sector to build up private sector competitiveness, but also on the health side of things. Post-earthquake, there were many, many issues, of course, I'm sure you're aware of. We've moved out of some of those, the infrastructure, into things like housing finance and whatnot, but basically to create a situation of stability in order to reduce the possibility of illegal immigrants coming from a place like Haiti, same in Central America.
In addition, sir, we're working closely with the Department of Homeland Security on a new initiative in this administration to address the problem of recalcitrant countries and their unwillingness to accept the repatriation of duly deported individuals who are ready for deportation.
I'm really glad to hear that you're supportive of the move of the DHS to take over consular deportation activities. Get it out of State Department. That's the proposal. The proposal is to move it to the Department of Homeland Security, right?
I'm not aware of any proposal at this time, but what I was referencing, sir, was the effort that the State Department, with the Department of Homeland Security, is looking at ways that we can enhance the repatriation of individuals who are identified for deportation to recalcitrant countries
So is there
that have
any,
not taken
thought
them
about
back.
cutting off their money, or are we going to continue to fund programs while they won't do it?
There, depending on the country, we have a lot of different interests that are in play, but it is very clear under this administration that we are addressing the problem of recalcitrant countries. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield.
I thank the gentleman. Now go to Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome. The Inspector General for the Department of State and Justice released a report recently that says that the State Department employees were involved in a cover-up of a 2012 incident where a drug raid in Honduras went wrong and 4 civilians were killed. The report finds that the State Department employees failed to comply with and undermine the ambassador's chief of mission authority. How is the State Department holding accountable these employees cited in the IG's report?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Espaillat. The IG's report is being handled at the department, and we are preparing our response to those recommendations.
Okay. How are we doing with so far as the nominations of potential ambassadors in Latin America and the Caribbean? Where are we now? Because many of these countries are in instability or right in the middle of a crisis. Do we have any progress with regards to appointments, nomination and appointments?
Yeah, I believe the administration is making significant progress on the appointment of ambassadors in the Western Hemisphere. We have nominees for Canada, the Bahamas, Guatemala, Peru, and Costa Rica, and are working on their nominations, sir.
Okay. TPS is about to expire for the triangle countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. What is the State Department's position of continuing TPS for several 100,000 people in the U.S. that are under that status?
A temporary protective status, TPS, is a Department of Homeland Security authority, and we will wait for them to consult with us at an appropriate time ahead of that decision, sir.
Last year, President Obama signed into law a bipartisan U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act authored by both Representative Engels and Ross Lehtinen. The administration recently released its new strategy for engaging with the sub-region, which was mandated by the bill. Writing a strategy is one thing, but implementing one is another. What are you planning to do to implement this particular initiative?
Well, we began last week. Undersecretary Tom Shannon and I attended the summit of CARICOM heads of government in Grenada. We had extensive meetings during the 2 days that we were there with different heads of government to talk about the strategy that we prepared in response to the legislation and to consult with them on the priorities that we've listed in that report. We will continue to consult stakeholders here in the United States, continue conversations with the Congress, and develop that proposed strategy and implement it as quickly and as effectively as we can.
Thank you. Now, the Caribbean Basic Security Initiative is another important initiative for a geopolitical region that is very important to us. And there's currently an economic meltdown in Puerto Rico. Cuba is still very unstable. The Dominican Republic and Haiti are also facing great challenges, opening the door there for perhaps increasing crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking. We've seen a reduction in the budget for that region from $57.7 million to $36.2, and a 36% reduction altogether. So how are we going to be able to respond to the emerging need of that important region for the United States, given the fact that there's been such a dramatic cut in aid for that particular region of the world?
Foreign assistance was reduced globally. In the Caribbean, earlier aspects of the Caribbean Security Initiative focused on bigger ticket items like maritime vessels. And now, as we move forward in the CBSI, our programs are more focused toward capacity building, training, and maintenance. And so we believe we can continue to use the level of funding that's available to us to advance our national interests there, sir.
Thank you for your answers. Thank you so much.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I'll go down to Mr. DeSantis from Florida.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. I appreciate your service. Would like to start seeing some of the folks who are going to be the actual appointees nominated and confirmed. I think that's important, particularly for the Western Hemisphere. I've been supportive, and I know the chairman has, of Mauricio Claron. I think he would do a great job, but bottom line is we'd love to see these decisions made so that these folks can get in place. But I appreciate what you're doing. Let me just ask you this to follow up with my friend from Florida. Why hasn't the State Department ever halted visas when some of these countries will not take back particularly the criminal illegal aliens? Under the law, if they're not doing it, State Department shuts off visas until they start to do it. But we've never done that, and I just don't know why.
I think that's a very good question, and I would want to consult closely with our Bureau of Consular Affairs. I know the decision to cease visa processing is a very serious one that also has impacts on the U.S. economy in terms of people being able to travel back and forth who might not fall.
Well, without question, but I think if you use it, then I think that a lot of the countries are going to change their behavior because there's a lot of effects on their economies too. And as I understand the law, it's once DHS says, hey, these countries are recalcitrant, it used to be the Attorney General before DHS because this law predated DHS, then I think the State Department has to do it. And we've been trying to figure out, is it DHS that's just not providing this to the State Department, or is the State Department dragging its feet? And it may be the former as well. But I think if we can get in a situation where these countries are respecting this, where particularly these criminal illegals, bringing them back, they're accepting that. I don't even think you'd need to use it then. But I think at some point you got to do something because they figured out they're just not going to play ball with us. And I think the tragedy has been that has harmed some of our citizens here when these people are released into American society. Let me ask you about Cuba. We had a big policy change in Cuba announced in the winter of 2015. Have human rights on the island improved since that policy change in December of 2015?
I think the President Trump's new policy review of our Cuba policy focuses exactly on that question. How can we ensure that U.S. engagement promotes human rights and democracy on the island?
Is it fair to say that there has not really been an improvement? Because as I watched it, people said, hey, the policy hasn't worked, we got to change. Then you change the policy, and you actually had political arrests go up, and you had even more repression in some respects. And so I don't think you could say, I appreciate the President's review of this and changes. I think those are positive steps. But man, for those 2 years or year and a half, I didn't see very much progress. Am I wrong?
I think the policy review clearly reflects that we need to work to ensure that U.S. engagement in Cuba produces the kind of progress you're talking about.
Venezuela, it's just been an absolute disgrace what is going on there. We've been engaged on this committee for now, a long time, since you've really been chairman. And I'd like to see us do more to empower the people that are being oppressed. What is the State Department doing? Is there more Congress can do to help the people that are suffering under the yoke of the Maduro dictatorship?
I think we share the same exact view that we need to find ways to better assist the Venezuelan people in the face of crises of a political, economic, and humanitarian nature. The State Department continues to press the Venezuelan government to honor its commitments to the Vatican-led dialogue last fall, specifically to address the humanitarian needs of the Venezuelan people, to respect the role of the National Assembly,
well, we've obviously seen, and those would all be great. The question is it feasible that this regime will actually ever do any of that, or do we really just need to hope that this regime crumbles and that we can have a new regime take its place? I mean, I don't see how Maduro will ever go in the direction that we want. I mean, you just look at how failed the society is. They're the number one, they're sitting on the number one amount of oil reserves in the world, and yet they have gas shortages. You have people that are losing 15, 20 pounds a year because they have food shortages. It is an absolute failure, but I think what he's shown is anytime the people suffer, he always errs on just trying to cling to his own power, and he's not been open to reform. Am I wrong?
I think the record in Venezuela is very clear, as you've outlined.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now I'll go down to Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding a hearing today on advancing U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. The Trump administration has made it a priority to deter illegal migration and combat transnational criminal organizations. However, the president's budget significantly cuts assistance to every country and regional program in Latin America and the Caribbean. Many of these cuts will affect programs that directly work on issues related to immigration and crime. For example, the U.S. Strategy for Engagement in Central America, which addresses underlying conditions that affect migration, will receive a 39% funding cut. The budget has shifted the remaining aid towards security efforts and away from governance and economic growth programs. However, a country's economic and political circumstances affect its ability to provide national security and stability. Economic prosperity and good governance directly affect the country's ability to combat crime. That's why it's vital that the United States continues to provide assistance. With such dramatic cuts in aid, would the United States be able to continue to play a meaningful role in the economic and political development of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean? And how does cutting these programs endanger U.S. interests in the region for both of you?
You know, as Secretary Tillerson said in his testimony before the full committee's hearing in Congress, the level of funding devoted to a particular goal is not the most important factor in achieving it. We believe the budget request prioritizes programs that directly support national security imperatives in the region, including stopping transnational criminal organizations and reducing the flow of illegal migrants and illicit goods. And we will use all of the resources that we do have at our disposal to advance U.S. national security and economic prosperity in this region.
Yes, likewise. And in a constrained budget environment, I think what the budget reflects is doubling down on the areas that you mentioned, as my colleague mentioned, also illegal migration and the production and transit of illegal drugs north. In addition, though, we are building on the programming that we've already done and increasing efforts to leverage resources from the private sector to get more engaged in these efforts as well. Also, we're encouraging other donors to get involved. My colleague mentioned the Central America Conference, which besides the member states from those countries, we had participation from Canada, from Spain. The EU has expressed interest in this region as well as Japan. So it's a holistic approach to the region.
So you're trying to find others to supplement where those huge cuts are.
It's an opportunity for others to participate in these efforts. I mean, I think the environment, a secure and stable hemisphere is important to those donors that I mentioned as well, and the private sector.
And have you been successful thus far in finding private or other countries?
Yes, we've leveraged several $1 million. I'll throw out El Salvador as an example, where we have something like 11 or 12 small and micro enterprises that have created over 20,000 jobs for Salvadorans and increased sales in those industries by $150 million. And that's with the help of the private sector. We also have experience with Microsoft in El Salvador that I mentioned previously, and then a consortium of private sector organizations, Haynes Company, Walmart, Citi, et cetera, that are involved in educational opportunities for at-risk youth.
Well, there's a lot of countries to cover, so I hope you're successful. Following up on the Honduras investigation, are adequate reparations or other compensations contemplated for the Honduran victims of the Awas incident detailed in the report?
I believe in previous appropriations, there has been an effort to make some assistance to the group in that area, but we would want to get back a more fuller answer for the record.
I would appreciate that. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Recognize myself for another round of questions. Just because of where we are in the hearing. Colombia, largest producer of coca, largest supplier of cocaine seized here in America. Santos dramatically reduced the eradication during the FARC negotiations as a concession. So eradication went down, coca production went up, cocaine supply is at a maybe an all-time high. How will the terms of the peace process as it relates to coca eradication affect the ability of the U.S. to support Colombian eradication efforts?
The Colombian government is developing or has developed a strategy to deal with this increase in coca leaf cultivation and the subsequent increase in cocaine production. We are working our assistance programs on the counter-narcotics side to complement and support that effort. And I think it will be imperative that our effort and their efforts show immediate results as quickly as we can, given the increase in coca cultivation that you've signaled.
Right. So the FARC and people that were involved in the FARC are now going to have to find other employment. The concern for the Colombians on what these people are going to do. Is there anything in the budget, USAID-wise, what's the number plus up, if there are any, to assist the Colombians and have the Colombians ask us to help them with that through USAID?
There is definitely a component to the peace plan implementation and to our assistance program that envisions enhancing the state of Colombia's presence in these regions and promoting alternative developments. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yes, the $105 million I think that we've requested in FY18 will go towards 3 areas: extending state presence where it hasn't been seen in a while in Colombia, improving rural economies there, and then reintegration and inclusive programming. So we're working right now, AID, in 40 of the 58 most insecure areas of Colombia, trying to transform those into areas where there will be licit possibilities for the farmers. Tumaco is a great example where we've already helped about 5,000 families and created 2,000 jobs. So we are supporting the Colombians to make further progress in those areas.
I think if the peace process is going to be successful in the long run, you're going to have to find other employment. They're going to have to retrain. They're going to have to build schools and roads and other. Colombia's got a challenge ahead of them. I think Santos knows that based on our conversations. Ranking member, you have another question?
Yes, I want to get back to Nicaragua. Is there any money in the budget to counteract the influence of Russia in Nicaragua? I know they have, they sold 50 tanks and they're opening up a listening post. And I was wondering, how are we focusing on that?
Well, we do provide some funding for international military education and training that allows us to maintain U.S. military engagement with elements of the security forces in Nicaragua. We also do some counter-narcotics cooperation with Nicaraguan security forces as well. The Russian presence there is focused on a counter-narcotics training facility that they've created.
And as far as Costa Rica is concerned, I think they're one of our best friends that we have there in terms of dealing with this narco-traffic issue. Are we cutting any of their money?
With respect to Costa Rica, I agree, sir. They are one of our best friends and allies in the entire hemisphere, not just in the fight against counter-narcotics, but on a whole range of political issues. We will be looking at ways that we can use current year funding to assist them. In the out year, they will benefit from the Central America Regional Security Initiative, and they will receive funding.
Didn't we just turn a boat over to them or help them buy a boat?
I have to confess, I do know that there's an effort underway, and I'll have to get the specifics on the desire to.
I'm talking about a speedboat, you know, to deal with the.
Yeah. I'm sorry, sir. I'll get you a fuller answer on that. I don't know it off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Chair will now recognize and welcome to the hearing Mr. Meeks. 5 minutes.
Just when you thought you could go home early.
It's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you. Let me start out. I had some questions, and really, I guess they probably were more appropriate. One is more appropriate for Secretary Tillerson than you, Mr. Palmieri, or Ms. Lynch, because it goes into conflicts of interest or potentially conflicts of interest of the dealing with the president's businesses and what he's doing. And so, I started to ask that question, but I think I'm not going to ask either one of you that. I don't want to put you on the spot. I know you're there acting. We don't want you. We need few. There's only a few people there now. We don't need anybody to lose anybody. So I'll hold off on asking those questions. But I will ask you questions that I asked the secretary when he appeared here, and I was waiting to get an answer back, and I did not, and I have not received one yet. And maybe you can give me an answer. And one is to deal with the State Department led a U.S.-Brazil joint action plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination and promote equality. And the U.S.-Colombia Action Plan on Racial and Ethnic Equality have been important ways to collaborate and coordinate efforts to address systemic racial discrimination. What resources, this was my question, within the State Department are dedicated to continue to support of these important mechanisms for the advancement of the marginalized and underserved communities in Brazil and Colombia?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Meeks. And the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs is very proud of the work we have done to promote social inclusion, race, ethnicity, and social inclusion programming into our efforts in the hemisphere. The two agreements that you initiatives you've pointed out with Brazil and Colombia will continue. We continue to have a staff who will work on that, and we will use different pots of available funding for exchange programs and other programs to continue to spotlight the need for progress in those two programs, sir.
USAID, Ms. Lynch?
Thank you. Yes, we consider this a core value of USAID and all of the programming that we do. And in this region, we have made it a top priority to have inclusivity in all of our programming. In Colombia, I mentioned earlier that we're in 40 of the 58 most difficult parts of the country, and those are largely populated by Afro-Colombians, indigenous people, and our inclusivity programming includes women and others that do not have traditional access to either services by the state or economic opportunities. So it's very important to us, and we will continue to address that issue.
Thank you. And likewise, and I go back to Mr. Palmieri, the indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities in Colombia have been some of the hardest hit by the decades of conflict in that nation. And the peace agreement that, it has the potential, at least, to bring advancements. But the post-conflict period of time has increased the vulnerability of many that are in that area. And when you look at the violence in the remote areas of Colombia, which is home to many in these African Colombian and indigenous communities, and where a lot of the FARC is coming back into, how do you envision with the fiscal year 2018 budget requests with 44% drop in assistance affecting the Afro-Colombian and indigenous populations in Colombia, and to what extent could the State Department prepare to assist these communities and USAID in this post-conflict phase?
I think as part of the Colombia peace process, working with these communities is a significant part of the peace plan implementation program of the Colombian government. And I think as AID has indicated, and I'll let Sarah Ann give more details, this continues to be a core value. And obviously, any peace plan implementation process to be successful, it will need to address and incorporate these communities into the development efforts.
Thank you. Yes, our programming in Colombia has been preparing for peace for some time. So we've included the indigenous and Afro-Colombians and other marginalized populations in our programming already. So what we plan to do is build on that programming and improve it and double down on it and make sure that these populations are a priority.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but I just want to, just while I didn't, and I will not ask either of these witnesses questions about my concerns on the conflicts of interest within the Trump administration. I just want to note for the record that I do have concerns. And I know some of my colleagues have concerns also, but I'm not going to do that to these individuals or to you, Mr. Chairman.
You're going to wait
and I
for
want-
Secretary Tillerson, I guess.
That's right. But I want the record to be noted anytime I speak.
The gentleman yields back, and I know we're all looking forward to Secretary Tillerson coming to the committee on the budget, which will happen in full committee. I do have a letter to President Trump about Venezuela, which I would like to include in the record. I'm going to leave the record open for 5 days for members to add additional statements, possible other questions, including that letter. So without objection, that will remain open for 5 days. And there being no further business of the subcommittee, will stand adjourned. And I thank the witnesses very much for being here. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, now that we're going to have to be here, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Duncan, question for you. Now that we're going to have to be here for August, are you delaying the trip so I can make it?
Get through before you even got here.
Ms. Lynch, Mr. Palmieri, thank you.
There is a conflict. I don't want to mention it, but I'll mention the conflict. Come on.
I'm going on vacation.
Good seeing you go.
already, but we're going to continue, and we'll do our best. It's a really important program.
I got my ticket.
Out to visit our
Thank you,
programs,
guys.
too.
I'd
If
love
you
to
ever
do
get to
that.
Colombia, it's,
Well, I'm working on trying to get to Columbia now. That's exactly what I'm working on. So,
Okay.
we're saying she wants to see when we go to Columbia, we go see what they're doing.
Yeah, and that's, having eyes on it's the best way.
Yes,
So
I
it
agree.
is really would love that, so.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.